Something has fundamentally changed in the Middle East, and many people still haven't understood the magnitude of what just happened. For decades, Israel operated under a simple assumption. No matter how controversial its actions became, no matter how many wars erupted across the region, and no matter how isolated it appeared diplomatically, there would always be two guarantees. The first was overwhelming military superiority. The second was unconditional American support. Together, those two pillars formed the foundation of Israeli strategy. But what happens when both pillars begin to crack at the same time? That's the question we're going to answer today. And stay with me until the end, because what we're witnessing is not merely another Middle Eastern crisis. It may be the beginning of a geopolitical transformation that neither Washington nor Tel Aviv is fully prepared for. Let's start with the reality that few politicians are willing to acknowledge publicly. For years, Israeli leaders believed that force could solve almost every strategic problem. If resistance emerged in Gaza, military force would contain it. If Hezbollah expanded its influence, military force would deter it. If Syria became a threat, military force would neutralize it. If Iran expanded its regional influence, military force would eventually eliminate it. This mindset became deeply embedded in Israeli strategic thinking because for decades there appeared to be evidence supporting it. Israel won wars. Israel maintained military dominance. Israel retained American backing. Israel faced criticism but rarely meaningful consequences. That created a dangerous illusion. The illusion was that military superiority automatically translated into strategic success. But history teaches us something very different. Military superiority can win battles. It can destroy infrastructure. It can eliminate targets. But it cannot automatically create political stability. And that's exactly where the current crisis begins. Because if you look across the region today, what do you see? Do you see stability? Do you see peace? Do you see a secure strategic environment? No. You see a region more volatile than at any point in recent memory. You see multiple active conflicts. You see growing anti-Israeli sentiment. You see increasing skepticism toward American leadership. You see Iran stronger strategically than many Western analysts predicted. And perhaps most importantly, you see a generation of people around the world viewing Israel through a completely different lens than previous generations did. That may be the most significant development of all, because wars are not fought only on battlefields. They are fought in public opinion, they are fought through legitimacy, they are fought through perception, and Israel is losing ground in those areas at an alarming rate. Now, if you think that's merely a public relations issue, think again. Because legitimacy is a strategic asset. When a nation loses legitimacy internationally, it becomes harder to build coalitions, harder to secure diplomatic support, harder to justify military operations, harder to maintain long-term alliances. This is where many Israeli leaders made a profound miscalculation. They assumed that American political support would remain permanent regardless of circumstances. But political realities change. Public opinion changes. Generations change. And right now, something unprecedented is happening in the United States. For the first time in modern history, significant portions of the American public are openly questioning the relationship with Israel. That's a development that would have been almost unimaginable 20 years ago. And if you thought that was bad, it's only going to get worse from now on. Because what we're seeing is not temporary frustration. It's a structural shift. Young Americans view the conflict differently. Independent voters view the conflict differently. Even mainstream political figures are beginning to take positions that would have been politically impossible just a decade ago. This matters because Israel's strategic security has always depended not only on weapons and technology, but also on political support in Washington. And political support ultimately depends on voters. That's the reality. Now let's talk about Netanyahu, because his role in this crisis cannot be ignored. Benjamin Netanyahu has spent decades cultivating an image of strategic mastery. He's often portrayed as a leader who understands power better than anyone else in the region. But there's a difference between tactical success and strategic success. Tactical success focuses on immediate gains. Strategic success focuses on long-term outcomes. And that's where serious questions begin to emerge. Because if we examine the long-term trajectory of the region, many of the developments now threatening Israel actually accelerated during the period when Israel was pursuing maximum pressure strategies. Iran expanded influence. Regional instability increased. Resistance movements adapted. Public opinion shifted. And international criticism intensified. Those are not indicators of strategic success. Those are indicators of a deteriorating environment. Now, perhaps Netanyahu believed these trends could be reversed through one decisive confrontation. Perhaps he believed that removing Iran from the equation would fundamentally transform the region. Many policymakers in Washington shared that assumption, but assumptions are not reality. Reality is what happens when plans collide with facts, and the facts are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Iran did not collapse. Iran did not surrender. Iran did not abandon its regional posture. Instead, Iran adapted. That's what sophisticated adversaries do. They adapt. And adaptation is one of the most powerful weapons in modern conflict. Because modern wars are not decided solely by who has the most advanced technology, they are decided by who can endure, who can adjust, who can absorb pressure, who can continue functioning despite disruption. Iran spent decades preparing for precisely this kind of confrontation. That preparation is now paying dividends. And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of the entire crisis: deterrence. Most people think deterrence means preventing attacks through fear. That's partially true. But real deterrence operates on a deeper level. Real deterrence convinces an opponent that the cost of escalation exceeds the benefits. That's exactly what Iran has accomplished. Think about it. The United States possesses extraordinary military capabilities: carrier strike groups, strategic bombers, advanced missiles, global logistics. Yet despite all of that power, Washington remains hesitant. Why? Because military planners understand the consequences. They understand what could happen if the conflict expands. They understand what could happen to energy infrastructure. They understand what could happen to global markets. They understand what could happen to the world economy. And suddenly the conversation changes. It's no longer about whether the United States can strike Iran. Of course it can. The real question becomes whether the United States can control what happens afterward. That's a very different question, and one with no easy answer. Stay with me, because this next point explains why the entire balance of power may be shifting beneath our feet. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a waterway. It's one of the most important economic arteries on the planet. A huge percentage of global energy supplies pass through that narrow corridor. Oil, natural gas, industrial commodities, critical resources. Everything connected to modern economic activity depends, directly or indirectly, on stability in that region. Now imagine what happens if that stability disappears. Energy prices surge, shipping costs rise, insurance rates skyrocket, supply chains fracture, inflation accelerates, economic growth slows, political instability spreads, and suddenly a regional conflict becomes a global crisis. This is the leverage Iran possesses, not because Iran is stronger militarily than the United States, but because geography matters, strategic location matters, economic interdependence matters, and modern economies are extraordinarily vulnerable to disruption. That's why deterrence works, because military strength alone cannot solve economic vulnerability. Now let's expand the picture even further. China is watching, Russia is watching, India is watching, the Gulf states are watching, everyone is watching. Because this confrontation is no longer only about Israel and Iran. It's becoming a test of the entire international order. For decades, the United States operated under the assumption that it could shape events across multiple regions simultaneously. But maintaining that level of influence requires enormous resources: economic resources, military resources, political resources, and those resources are not unlimited. That's another reality policymakers dislike discussing. Power has limits. Even great powers have limits. The question is whether Washington recognizes those limits before events force recognition upon it. Historically, declining powers often make the same mistake. They assume that because they were dominant yesterday, they will remain dominant tomorrow. History rarely works that way. Power shifts gradually, then suddenly, and when those shifts occur, leaders often fail to recognize them until it's too late. Now, if you've stayed with me this far, you already understand why this situation is so dangerous. Because we're not simply witnessing another Middle Eastern conflict. We're witnessing a collision between an old geopolitical order and an emerging one. The old order was built on American unipolar dominance. The emerging order is increasingly multipolar. China has risen. Russia has reasserted itself. Regional powers have become more independent. Alternative economic systems are emerging. New alliances are forming, and the assumptions that guided policy for decades are being challenged. This is why decision-makers in Washington appear increasingly frustrated. The tools that worked in the past are producing diminishing returns. Sanctions produce adaptation. Military pressure produces resilience. Political coercion produces alternative partnerships. The world is changing, and not everyone has accepted that reality yet. But what happens next may be even more significant. Because beneath all of these military and geopolitical developments lies something far more powerful: the question of whether America itself is willing to continue paying the cost of endless confrontation. And once that question begins dominating political debate inside the United States, the entire strategic equation changes in ways that neither Washington nor Tel Aviv can fully control. What makes this situation even more dangerous is that the political reality inside the United States is beginning to diverge sharply from the geopolitical reality overseas. For decades, American leaders could assume that foreign policy crises would remain distant from everyday American life. Wars happened elsewhere, sanctions targeted other countries, military deployments occurred thousands of miles away. The average American might notice a headline but rarely felt the direct consequences. That equation is changing now. And if you think that's an exaggeration, look at what happens every time instability hits global energy markets. Prices rise, transportation costs increase, supply chains become more expensive, inflation pressures return, businesses postpone investments, families feel the impact almost immediately. Suddenly, a conflict in the Middle East is no longer a distant geopolitical event. It becomes a domestic political issue, and that changes everything. This is the problem many strategists failed to anticipate. They assume that because the United States possesses overwhelming military power, it could absorb the consequences of prolonged confrontation indefinitely. But military power and economic resilience are not the same thing. A nation can possess the most advanced military on earth and still struggle with the economic consequences of its foreign policy decisions. In fact, history is filled with examples of great powers exhausting themselves financially while remaining militarily formidable. The British Empire experienced it. The Soviet Union experienced it, and now many analysts are beginning to ask whether the United States is drifting toward a similar predicament. The reason this question matters is because every major geopolitical strategy ultimately depends on sustainability. Can it be maintained over time? Can the economy support it? Can the public support it? Can allies support it? If the answer to those questions begins shifting from yes to no, the strategy itself becomes vulnerable regardless of how powerful the military remains. Now let's talk about something even more significant: perception among America's allies. Because if you thought this crisis was only changing how adversaries view American power, think again. Allies are watching very carefully. The Gulf states are watching. European governments are watching. Asian partners are watching. And they're asking a simple question: if a major confrontation emerges tomorrow, can the United States still guarantee outcomes the way it once could? That question would have sounded absurd 20 years ago. Today it sounds increasingly reasonable. Why? Because credibility is not built on rhetoric. Credibility is built on results, and recent results have been deeply mixed. Afghanistan ended with withdrawal. Iraq produced instability. Libya descended into chaos. Ukraine has become a grinding war of attrition. And now the confrontation with Iran has exposed limitations that many policymakers preferred not to discuss publicly. That doesn't mean America is weak. Far from it. But it does mean that overwhelming superiority no longer guarantees strategic success, and that realization is spreading. Stay with me, because this next point explains why Netanyahu's calculations may have fundamentally underestimated the scale of the changes taking place globally. For years, Israeli strategy operated on the assumption that American power would remain the central organizing force in international politics. That assumption shaped everything: security planning, diplomatic planning, regional strategy, long-term objectives. But what happens if the international system becomes genuinely multipolar? What happens if countries gain alternative partnerships? What happens if economic relationships become more important than military alignments? What happens if American influence remains significant but no longer decisive? Those are the questions now confronting Israeli decision-makers, and they are extraordinarily difficult questions because they challenge assumptions that have guided policy for decades. This is where China enters the picture in a way many Western audiences still fail to appreciate. China's rise was never primarily about military expansion. It was about economic transformation, infrastructure, manufacturing, technology, investment, trade. While much of the world focused on wars, China focused on industrial capacity. While governments spent trillions on military campaigns, China invested in transportation networks, energy systems, technological development, and manufacturing ecosystems. The result is that China now occupies a position in the global economy that no major power can easily ignore. That changes the strategic equation dramatically because modern power is not only measured by military capability, it is measured by industrial capability, technological capability, economic capability, supply chain capability, and increasingly China dominates those conversations. Now ask yourself an important question. If the future of global competition is increasingly economic rather than military, who benefits from prolonged instability in the Middle East? Certainly not China. China wants stability. China wants energy flows. China wants predictable trade. China wants functioning supply chains. War disrupts all of those objectives. That's one reason Beijing approaches these crises so differently than Washington. Its incentives are different. Its priorities are different. Its strategic vision is different. And as these differences become more apparent, countries around the world begin reassessing where their long-term interests actually lie. This is one of the hidden stories of the current crisis. It's not simply about who wins a confrontation. It's about which model of international order appears more sustainable. The model built around military coercion or the model built around economic integration? That debate is becoming increasingly important. And if you thought that was bad, it's only going to get worse from now on. Because the more instability spreads, the more countries search for alternatives. The more alternatives emerge, the less influence traditional power centers possess. The less influence they possess, the harder it becomes to enforce existing arrangements. This creates a feedback loop that accelerates geopolitical change. Now let's return to Netanyahu because the consequences for Israel may extend far beyond immediate security concerns. One of the most remarkable developments of the past several years has been the transformation of global public opinion. Information moves faster. Narratives spread faster. Events are documented in real time. Governments no longer control information the way they once did, and as a result, public perceptions can change very rapidly. This matters because international legitimacy is becoming increasingly important in a connected world. Economic relationships depend on it. Political relationships depend on it. Diplomatic relationships depend on it. And when a nation experiences a legitimacy crisis, those relationships become harder to maintain. That is the strategic danger facing Israel. Not because Israel lacks military strength, not because Israel lacks technological sophistication, but because legitimacy, once lost, is extremely difficult to recover. And many observers believe that process has already begun. Now here's where things become truly significant. The crisis surrounding Israel, Iran, and the United States is not occurring in isolation. It is connected to broader global trends, the rise of multipolarity, the fragmentation of globalization, the emergence of alternative financial systems, the growing importance of regional powers, the decline of unquestioned Western dominance. All of these developments reinforce each other. And together they create a world that looks very different from the one policymakers assumed would exist after the Cold War. For 30 years, many leaders believed history had ended. They believed the future would simply involve expanding the existing order indefinitely. But history never ends. Power shifts, technology changes, economies evolve, societies transform, and eventually every international order faces challenges. That's what we're witnessing now. The challenge isn't coming from one country. It's coming from structural changes across the entire system, and those changes cannot be bombed away. They cannot be sanctioned away. They cannot be wished away. They must be understood and adapted to. That's the lesson many governments still struggle to learn. Now, if you've stayed with me this far, then you've probably realized something important. The real issue isn't whether Netanyahu crossed a line. The real issue is whether the assumptions that guided Israeli and American strategy for decades are still valid. Because if those assumptions are no longer valid, then every decision built upon them becomes increasingly risky. And that's why this moment feels different. Not because another conflict has erupted, not because another crisis has emerged, but because for the first time in a long time, fundamental questions are being asked about the future of power itself. Can military dominance still guarantee political success? Can economic pressure still dictate outcomes? Can old alliances still function the same way in a changing world? Can a unipolar order survive in a multipolar reality? Those questions don't have simple answers, but they are the questions that will define the coming decade. And the leaders who recognize the changing landscape earliest will have the greatest chance of navigating it successfully. The leaders who continue operating according to outdated assumptions may discover that the world changed while they were still trying to preserve the past. That is the deeper significance of everything happening right now, not just for Israel, not just for the United States, but for the entire international system, because we may be witnessing the end of one geopolitical era and the uncertain beginning of another. And history teaches us that those transitions are rarely peaceful, rarely predictable, and almost never reversible once they begin.